Hey folks, this is week 15. This is the last lecture video, sadly or happily for some of you, but we'll just be talking about the conclusion and chapter 4 of Veracini. I'll try to make a couple of wrap up points, and then I'll ask for the last question of the semester for your one paragraph assignment. So I'll just sort of pick up where the last discussion kind of left off, was thinking about settler consciousness and what settler consciousness is and what it has to do with the idea of narrative, right? For me, it goes back to a very specific sort of trajectory that Veracini is trying to set out for us. And I think this is really important for us to consider, especially with regard to the notion of production. We started Veracini thinking about economies, and at every point of sort of description of the settler colonial process, we see how settler colonialism unfolds through modes of production, modes of population production, modes of sovereignty production. In chapter 3, modes of consciousness production, and now, of course, in chapter 4, we have narrative production. What I think is really important to stress here is that narrative production is just as important to the settler colonial project as each of the other modes. And for Veracini, they loop. They sort of connect to one another. They inform one another. And by doing so, we see that the settler colonial production loop really hinges on the continuation of a settler colonial narrative that informs a consciousness that perpetuates the sort of violences implicit to sovereignty and population production at the heart of colonialism, or settler colonialism in the context of the United States, and for Veracini, other places like New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. So when we talk about narrative production, in my book, I specifically use this theory of narrative production within settler colonial context when describing how the perpetuation of the position of the settler, the self-defensive position as somebody who's forgotten the original violences, always seems to find themselves amidst an invasion, right? The settler colonial consciousness is built around these sort of double imaginations. On one hand, you have the imagination of the settler as native, and the settler must become native in order for them to have an identity connected to the land that they stole. Right? This is one of the things that's important for Veracini when we're thinking about settler colonial sovereignty in particular, is that sovereignty is gained through the violence of stealing others' lands and then having the folks who the land was stolen from either exterminated or eliminated. The land is often used, they often worked by other individuals who are not the settler themselves to sort of build wealth for the settler. But in the settler consciousness, this is all sort of one, all the work of the settler. Two, it all starts with the settler on this empty land. And three, by nativizing themselves, by making themselves indigenous, the settler can sort of say that any violence or any encroachment to that settler lifestyle or to that settler expression of sovereignty is in somehow an encroachment, and they take a self-defensive position. For me, this is really important when we think about extraterrestrial narratives, right? The book that I'm writing really relies on this idea that the settler colonial narrative embedded in the extraterrestrial sort of imagination of the United States is kind of ironic, considering that even H.G. Wells admitted when he wrote War of the Worlds that he was really writing about what colonialism looks like. Really, every extraterrestrial invasion narrative in the United States is just the replay of what European colonizers did to native peoples, highly technological eradication of peoples, stealing land, producing sort of economies for those extraterrestrial aliens. But in the way that it's imagined through settler colonial narrative, it's the settler who is the native who's being invaded. It's the settler colonizer who is being pushed out because of their lifestyle. In many ways, you see this discourse happening when we have folks who talk about pipeline protests. There's some folks who can't understand why native groups who have sovereign treaties to protect their lands are protesting capitalist settlers who are trying to take those lands for oil pipeline production. In many ways, right, we should be seeing the clear link to the settler colonial sovereignty and then the production of the self-defensive settler who brings water cannons and rubber bullets to essentially occupy a land, but use it in the name of self-defense, right? This is, to me, what's happening in many instances where we see folks who take self-defensive positions because they feel threatened, but in many ways that threat is really just narrated through settler colonial narrative. I think that we can really build on this idea of settler colonial narrative and how it builds into a settler colonial consciousness. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the second part of today's lecture.